The rain in Portland that morning wasn't the dramatic kind. It was the slow, mean kind that gets inside your collar and stays there. I'd flown in from Quantico the night before on 3 hours of sleep and a bad cup of airport coffee, and I told myself I wouldn't cry at the service. I broke that promise twice before the casket was even lowered. My brother Caleb was 29. He'd been the kind of person who remembered every waitress's name and tipped twice what he should. He had a startup that was actually starting to mean something, and 2 weeks before his funeral, he'd fallen off a ridge on Mount Hood that he'd hiked maybe 40 times in his life. The police report said weather conditions, loose scree, a moment of bad luck. I read it 4 times on the plane and something in my chest kept saying no. I was wearing the gray suit I keep for testifying in court. I'd packed a black dress, but when I unzipped my suitcase at the hotel that morning, I couldn't make my hands reach for it. The suit felt like armor. I needed armor. At the cemetery, my mother stood between me and my father like a wall of black wool. She hadn't looked at me since I'd arrived. I'd told her on the phone 3 days earlier that something about Caleb's death didn't sit right with me, and she'd hung up and called my aunt to say I was, quote, making it about my job again. That's what she always said when she wanted to make me small. About your job. About the FBI. About forensic accounting, like spending 11 years tracing money was a personality flaw. Caleb's fiancée stood across the grave from me in a long black coat. Her name was Marley, and she was 26, and she had the kind of careful beauty that looked like it had been workshopped in front of a mirror. She held a tissue she never quite used. Her best friend, a man named Jensen Holt, stood right behind her with his hand on her lower back, and when I noticed where that hand was, something cold uncurled in my stomach. I filed it. I didn't react. 11 years of interviews had taught me that you don't react. You file. After the burial, there was a reception at my parents' house in Lake Oswego. I stayed for 40 minutes. I drank tepid coffee from a paper cup and listened to my Aunt Beverly tell the same story about Caleb's 7th birthday 3 different ways. Marley accepted condolences with the practiced grace of someone who'd been practicing. Jensen brought her water without being asked. They were good. They were really, really good. I was at the door putting on my coat when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. Is this Adelaide Quinn, Caleb's sister? The voice was older, careful, controlled. A man used to being listened to. This is she. My name is Bernard Whitfield. I was Caleb's CEO at Halverson Pierce. I'm so sorry for your loss. I know this is the worst possible moment, but I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., alone. And Adelaide, please do not tell your family. Not your mother, not your father, not Marley. Especially not Marley. I stepped out onto the porch. The rain was thinner now. I could hear my mother laughing at something inside, a high, brittle laugh I hadn't heard since Caleb's college graduation. What is this about, Mr. Whitfield? 8 a.m., he said. Halverson Pierce, 18th floor. The badge at security will have your name. And Adelaide. Please come. Caleb left something with me. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I was to give it to you, not to his fiancée, not to your parents, to you. He hung up before I could answer. I stood on the porch with the phone still pressed to my ear and listened to my own breathing for a long moment. Then I walked to my rental car and drove back to my hotel and didn't sleep at all. Halverson Pierce occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower downtown. I'd never been inside, though I knew Caleb had worked there for almost 3 years. He was their senior product engineer. He built half their core architecture. He used to send me screenshots of code and pretend I understood any of it. The security guard handed me a temporary badge with my name printed neatly across the front. Adelaide Quinn, visitor. The elevator took me up so fast my ears popped, and when the doors opened, Bernard Whitfield was waiting for me. He was maybe 60, lean, with gray hair cut short and the kind of posture that comes from military service decades ago. He shook my hand once, firm, and led me down a hallway lined with patent certificates in matching frames. His office was at the end. He closed the door behind us and locked it. Sit down, please, he said. I sat. He went around his desk and pulled a sealed manila envelope out of his bottom drawer. It had my name written on it in Caleb's handwriting. "He came to me 3 months ago," Bernard said. "He told me he was worried. He'd noticed money missing from his accounts. Small amounts at first, then larger. He thought it was a banking error. Then he found out it wasn't. He showed me his transaction history. Someone with access to his login credentials had been moving funds in increments small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. Over 6 months, he lost just over $140,000. I didn't open the envelope yet. I let him talk. He didn't want to involve the police. He said he didn't have proof of who was doing it. He said if he was wrong, accusing the wrong person could destroy his family, but he gave me this." Bernard tapped the envelope. He said if anything ever happened to him, anything at all, I was to give it to his sister. Only to his sister. Because his sister worked for the federal government and would know what to do with it. I looked down at the envelope. My hand was shaking. "I made it stop. Mr. Canning. I made it stop. Mr. Canning. Whitfield, my brother died in a hiking accident." "I know what the police said. Do you have reason to believe otherwise?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 2 weeks before Caleb died, he came into this office and told me he was going to change his will. He said he was going to remove his fiancée as beneficiary. He said he was going to leave the bulk of his estate to a foundation in your grandmother's name. He said he had an appointment with an attorney the following Monday. He never made that appointment. 3 days later, he was on Mount Hood with Marley, and he didn't come back. I opened the envelope. Inside was a flash drive, a yellow legal pad with 3 pages of handwritten notes, and a single photograph. The photograph was a still from a security camera, time-stamped, 6 weeks before Caleb's death. It showed Marley in what looked like a hotel bar. She was leaning across a small round table, her hand on the wrist of a man whose face was clearly visible. Jensen Holt, her best friend. Caleb's best friend, supposedly. The one who'd had his hand on her lower back at the funeral. The handwritten notes were a timeline. Caleb had been keeping a record. The first entry was from 8 months before his death. The last was 3 days before he died. The final line read, in a hand that wavered slightly, "I think she knows I know." "How did you get the security still?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Caleb had it, he never told me how. He said only that he'd been right to follow them." I sat in that chair for a long time. Bernard didn't push. He poured me a glass of water from a pitcher on the credenza and set it in front of me and waited. Finally I said, "I need you to call the police. Adelaide, you are the police. Local police. Local police. Multnomah County. I need to file a report as next of kin, and I need to do it from this office, with you as witness. And I need you to forward everything you have to my supervisor at the Portland field office. I'm forensic accounting, not homicide, but I have colleagues, and I need this on the record by 10 a.m. So that if anything happens to me, anything at all, there's a paper trail that started here." He nodded slowly. "I understand." "And, Mr. Whitfield." "Yes. Thank you for believing him. I don't know if anyone else did." He looked at me for a long moment, and his eyes were wet, though his face stayed composed. "Your brother was the best engineer I've ever hired. He was also one of the best men. I would like very much to see the people who hurt him answer for it." I called my supervisor at 8:47 that morning. By noon, I had a meeting set with 2 agents from the Portland field office who handled financial crimes intersecting with violent crime. By 3, the flash drive was in a forensic lab. By the end of the day, I'd had a quiet conversation with a Multnomah County detective named Imani Brooks, who was younger than me, but had the kind of steady stillness I trusted on sight. She listened to everything. She asked good questions. She didn't promise anything. I checked into a different hotel that night under my middle name. I didn't tell my parents I was still in town. I told my mother on the phone that I'd flown back to Virginia and I'd call her in a few days. She said, "Good, take care of yourself, sweetheart," in the same voice she used to use to ask if I'd folded the laundry. Over the next 11 days, this is what we found. The flash drive contained months of evidence Caleb had been quietly assembling: bank records, login timestamps from his accounts that showed access from an IP address registered to Marley's mother's house in Beaverton. Email exchanges between Marley and Jensen that they thought were deleted, recovered by Caleb using a backup tool from his own workstation. Photographs of receipts Marley had filed with Caleb for shared expenses that turned out to be fabricated. A trip to Cabo she said she'd taken with girlfriends that had actually been her and Jensen in a suite paid for on Caleb's American Express. A pattern that went back almost a year. The forensic accounting was clean. It was, frankly, the cleanest case I'd ever seen, because my brother had built it the way I would have built it. He'd left everything in chronological order, cross-referenced with explanatory notes. He'd known what kind of mind would eventually look at it. He'd built it for me. The homicide piece took longer. Mount Hood had been wiped of any usable evidence by the weather and by the 2 weeks that had passed before anyone went looking. But Marley had made one critical mistake, and so had Jensen. 3 days after the funeral, Detective Brooks pulled their cell phone tower data. Both phones pinged a tower less than half a mile from Caleb's house at 1 a.m. on the night before he died. Marley had told the original investigators she'd been at her mother's that night. Jensen had told them he'd been home alone. Neither was true. They had been at Caleb's, together, the night before he supposedly drove himself to the trailhead. The medical examiner had ruled the cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. He had also noted in a section of his report that the original investigators hadn't pursued, that Caleb had elevated levels of a sleep aid in his bloodstream. A prescription he didn't have. A prescription he didn't have. A prescription Marley did. It took Detective Brooks about 6 weeks to build a case strong enough to bring to the district attorney. I spent most of that time in Portland, working from a cramped FBI satellite office, formally on leave but actually on the phone with my colleagues in Virginia every other hour. I didn't see my parents. My mother called 11 times. I let it ring. The raid happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:15. Marley had given notice on her apartment and bought 2 one-way tickets to Lisbon. The flight was scheduled for that evening. She and Jensen were at a short-term rental in Tea-Guard packing. I watched on a tablet from a black SUV 3 blocks away because Detective Brooks had insisted, kindly but firmly, that I not be on scene. I saw them brought out in cuffs on the tablet's small screen. Marley was crying in a way that struck me, professionally, as performance. Jensen wasn't crying at all. He looked exhausted and a little surprised, and very young. He'd been Caleb's best friend since they were 8 years old. They'd been in each other's weddings, except they hadn't gotten there yet, because Caleb was dead. I called my mother that afternoon from the hotel. I told her everything. I told her about Bernard, the flash drive, the timeline, the affair, the sleep aid, the cell tower data, the tickets to Lisbon. I told her I'd been working with detectives for the past 6 weeks. I told her her future daughter-in-law and her son's best friend were both in custody, charged with first-degree murder and a list of financial crimes that ran to 2 full pages. She was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said in a voice I'd never heard her use before, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because 3 days ago you told Aunt Beverly I was making Caleb's death about my job. I needed to be sure." She started to cry. My mother is not a woman who cries. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and listened to her cry for almost 20 minutes, and I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. Eventually she handed the phone to my father, who said only, "Adelaide, come home tomorrow. Please. Your mother and I need to see you." I went. My father met me at the door and put his arms around me and held on for a long time. My mother was in the kitchen, making coffee she wouldn't drink. She turned when I came in. She looked older than she had 2 months ago. She crossed the kitchen and took my face in both of her hands the way she used to when I was little, and she said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have believed you." I let her hold me. I cried a little. She cried more. My father stood in the doorway and didn't try to fix anything, which was, I think, the kindest thing he had ever done. We sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours that day. I told them everything Caleb had figured out before he died. I told them how much money had been stolen, what the affair had been, what the plan had been. Marley had been the primary beneficiary on Caleb's existing will. The intention, as far as our investigators could piece it together, had been to inherit the equity in Halverson Pierce, which had been valued at roughly $4.2 million in his most recent vesting cycle, sell it as quickly as possible, and disappear to Portugal with Jensen. The Lisbon flight had been booked the day after Caleb's funeral. They hadn't even waited. My mother kept asking the same question. Why? Why money? Why Caleb? Why this? I didn't have a good answer. I never have a good answer to why. 11 years of this work, and the why is always smaller than you expect. It's always a vacation, a house, a debt, a fantasy of being someone else somewhere else. Caleb died because two people wanted a beach and a balcony and the rest of their lives easy. The trial took 14 months to get to verdict. I testified twice. Once on the financial pattern, with charts and timelines and the certainty of someone who'd built her career on exactly this kind of testimony. Once on what Caleb had told me, the few small things he'd mentioned in the months before he died that, in hindsight, had been him trying to ask for help in a language he hadn't quite figured out yet. I cried on the stand the second time. I don't usually. The judge gave me a moment. The defense attorney did not, but I'd been in enough trials to know that wasn't personal. Jensen took a plea 3 weeks into the trial. He got 35 years with no possibility of parole for 25. He testified against Marley. Marley got life. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Honorable Patricia Holloway, looked Marley in the eye at sentencing and said, in the steadiest voice I have ever heard from a bench, "You took advantage of a man who loved you and trusted you, and you ended him for a beach house. There is no version of this court's authority that allows me to give you what you deserve, but what I can give you, I will." Marley didn't react. I'd watched her for 14 months, and I'd never seen her face do anything that wasn't deliberate. Even then, with the rest of her life being handed to her, she just blinked twice. My mother, sitting 2 rows behind me, made a sound in her throat that I won't forget as long as I live. Caleb's estate went where he had wanted it to go. Not where his last legal will said, but where his intentions, documented in his timeline and corroborated by Bernard's testimony, said it should go. After a long civil process, the bulk of the equity from Halverson Pierce was liquidated and placed into a foundation in our grandmother's name. Our grandmother had died of pancreatic cancer when Caleb and I were teenagers. The foundation funds research into early detection. The first grant went out last spring. I sat in the back of the auditorium when they announced it, and I cried, quietly, for a long time. The money Marley had stolen from his personal accounts, about $146,000 by the final accounting, was recovered from a series of shell accounts she and Jensen had set up in the Cayman Islands. Most of it went back to the estate. A small portion, about $12,000, had already been spent. The court ordered restitution. I doubt I'll ever see it. I don't really want it. My parents and I are different now. Not fixed. Different. My mother calls me every Sunday. She listens when I talk. My father has taken up fishing, which he says he doesn't enjoy, but which gets him out of the house. When I flew home for Thanksgiving last fall, my mother had hung a photograph of Caleb in the hallway between my high school graduation and his college one. She'd never had a picture of him out in the open while he was alive, because she thought it was tacky. She told me that when I asked, she said, "I was wrong about a lot of things, sweetheart. About what was tacky and what was tasteful. About what mattered. About you." I went to see Bernard Whitfield once, about a year after the verdict, when I was in Portland for a deposition on a different case. He'd retired by then. He met me at a coffee shop near the river. He looked older. We talked for an hour about ordinary things. As I was leaving, he said, "He told me once, about you. He said his sister could find a needle in a haystack made of needles. He was very proud of you." I didn't know what to say. I said thank you. He said, "Adelaide, the thing he gave me, the folder. He didn't give it to me because you worked for the federal government. He gave it to me because he trusted you more than anyone else in his life. I wanted you to know that." He didn't say it often, but he said it to me. I sat in my car for 20 minutes in that coffee shop parking lot before I could drive. A reporter from a true crime outlet contacted me last spring about doing a long-form piece on the case. I declined. She asked, in a follow-up email, If there was anything I wanted the public to know. I thought about it for a long time, and I almost didn't answer. Then I did. I told her this. Blood doesn't make a family. Trust does. The person who saved my brother's story was not his mother or his father, or his fiancé or his best friend. It was a 60-year-old CEO who barely knew him outside of work, who took a sealed envelope and held onto it for 3 months, and then made one phone call to a stranger. Because a quiet, careful young man had asked him to. If you love someone, watch their money. Watch their patterns. Watch the way the people closest to them treat them when they think no one is looking. Most of the time, it will be nothing. Sometimes it will be everything. My brother knew something was wrong for almost a year before he died, and he didn't tell anyone in our family because he was afraid we wouldn't believe him. I think about that more than I should. I keep his timeline in a fireproof safe in my apartment in Alexandria. The legal pad, the photograph, the flash drive. I will never need them again. The case is closed. But I keep them because they are the last thing my brother ever made, and because he made them, in some small, careful way, for me. I miss him every day. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life. But I did what he asked me to do. I did what only I could do. And in the end, that was the last thing I got to give him. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since Caleb died, about how every single thing that happened was the small, quiet result of something else. Marley didn't wake up one morning and decide to end my brother. She made one choice, and then another, and each one made the next one easier. The first time she logged into his account and moved $300, she probably told herself it was nothing. By the time she was sitting in a hotel bar with Jensen 6 weeks before the hike, she'd already stopped being someone who could turn back. That's how these things work. Nobody falls all at once. They lean, and then they lean further, and then there's no ground under them at all. I think about my brother differently now. I used to be the one in the family who got called the responsible one, the one who'd made something of herself, while Caleb was the soft one, the kind one, the one who maybe needed a little more looking after. I had that backwards. Caleb was the one who saw what was happening and started building a case in silence, alone, for almost a year, because he didn't want to ruin anyone's life on a guess. That isn't softness. That's a kind of courage I don't think I would have had. He kept going to work. He kept being kind to her. He kept building evidence in a yellow legal pad in a desk drawer because he wanted to be sure before he hurt anyone. He died being sure. What I want to say, to anyone watching this, is that the 3 things that saved my brother's story in the end were ordinary. They weren't dramatic. They were character. He had the moral spine to refuse to look away from what his own eyes were telling him about the woman he loved. He had the intelligence to document it carefully in a way that someone trained could eventually use. And he had the grit to keep going through almost a year of pretending everything was fine, so that when the day came, the truth would be unassailable. I think we live in a moment where people want shortcuts. They want the easy version of love, the easy version of family, the easy version of justice. There isn't one. The people who hurt my brother took the shortcut. They thought they could skip ahead to the beach house, and they're going to spend the rest of their lives in concrete rooms because shortcuts in this kind of math don't actually exist. The bill always comes. It just comes later than you'd like. If I could leave you with one thing, it would be this. Pay attention to the people you love. Not in a paranoid way, but in an honest one. And when something inside you says, wait, something here is wrong, don't talk yourself out of it just because it would be inconvenient to be right. My brother didn't. That's why I still have him, in the only way I can still have him, in the truth he left behind for me to carry.